In the span of 3 heartbeats, a single royal guard would face a choice that would either save a future king or cost him everything he had sworn to protect. The morning of March 30th, 1981, started like any other for Detective Sergeant Michael Thompson of the Metropolitan Police Protection Unit, but it would end with his name forever etched in the annals of British royal history. What happened that Tuesday afternoon outside a London charity event would test every instinct, every moment of training, and every fibre of courage in a man whose duty was simple in words but impossible in practice. Keep the royal family safe, no matter the cost. This is the story of a moment when split-second thinking, unwavering loyalty, and raw human courage stood between chaos and catastrophe. It's a tale that reminds us that heroes aren't born from extraordinary circumstances. They're revealed when ordinary people face extraordinary choices and decide to act, regardless of the consequences. What Detective Sergeant Thompson did that day didn't just save a life, it preserved a future that millions around the world would come to cherish and respect. Detective Sergeant Michael Thompson never imagined his childhood fascination with toy soldiers would one day translate into protecting real royalty. Born in a modest terraced house in Birmingham in 1945, Michael grew up during the final years of World War II, where the sound of air raid sirens and the sight of uniformed men became part of his earliest memories. His father, William Thompson, worked in a munitions factory, while his mother, Dorothy, volunteered with the Women's Voluntary Service, helping families whose homes had been damaged during the Blitz. The Thompson household was one where duty and service weren't just concepts discussed over dinner. They were lived values. William would return home each evening with stories of how everyone at the factory understood their small part in something much larger than themselves. Dorothy would speak of families who had lost everything, but still found ways to help their neighbours. For young Michael, these weren't lessons in patriotism or civic duty. They were simply how life worked. When Michael was 6 years old, his family witnessed something that would shape his understanding of service forever. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth visited Birmingham as part of a morale-boosting tour of industrial cities. The royal couple was scheduled to visit the munitions factory where William worked, and families of employees were invited to line the route. Michael remembered standing pressed against the metal barriers, his small hand gripping his father's larger one, watching as the royal car approached. What happened next wasn't dramatic or dangerous, but it was profound in its simplicity. As the royal car slowed to acknowledge the crowd, a small group of protesters began shouting about working conditions and wages. The crowd grew tense, some people pushing forward, others stepping back. In the confusion, an elderly woman stumbled and fell just feet from where the royal car had stopped. Without hesitation, one of the plainclothes security officers broke from his position, helped the woman to her feet, ensured she was unharmed, and then seamlessly returned to his protective stance. Michael watched this entire sequence unfold with the wide-eyed intensity that only children possess. He saw how the officer's actions were swift but gentle, protective but not aggressive, professional but undeniably human. The officer didn't seek recognition or acknowledgement. He simply did what needed to be done and returned to his duty. That image, of someone whose job was to protect, not for glory or recognition, but simply because it was right, would stay with Michael for the rest of his life. As Michael grew older, his path seemed naturally drawn towards service. In school, he excelled not just academically but in activities that required teamwork and responsibility. He served as a school prefect, captained his rugby team, and volunteered with local youth organizations. His teachers noted that Michael had an unusual quality for a teenager. He seemed to understand instinctively that leadership wasn't about commanding others, but about taking responsibility for their welfare. After completing his national service in the Royal Marines, where his natural leadership abilities and unflappable demeanor under pressure were quickly recognized, Michael faced a decision about his future. Many of his fellow Marines were transitioning to civilian careers in business or trade, but Michael found himself drawn to law enforcement. The idea of continuing to serve, of being part of something larger than himself, felt not just appealing but necessary. He joined the Metropolitan Police in 1967. At a time when London was experiencing significant social change. The late 60s brought protests, changing social attitudes, and new challenges for law enforcement. Michael's early years as a constable were spent in some of London's most challenging neighbourhoods, where he learnt that effective policing wasn't about authority or force, but about understanding people and situations. His colleagues quickly learnt that Michael possessed an unusual combination of physical courage and emotional intelligence. He could diffuse tense situations with words when possible, but wouldn't hesitate to act decisively when necessary. More importantly, he demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations, to sense when something wasn't quite right before it became obviously wrong. These qualities didn't go unnoticed by his superiors. Michael's arrest record was solid, his community relationships were excellent, and his fellow officers trusted him completely. But what really set him apart was his discretion and reliability. In sensitive situations involving public figures, politicians, or delicate community relations, Michael was increasingly the officer that senior commanders turned to. The transition from regular policing to protection duties wasn't something Michael actively sought, but rather something that seemed to seek him. In 1975, he was temporarily assigned to provide additional security during a visit by a foreign dignitary. The visit went smoothly, but the senior protection officers noted Michael's professionalism, his ability to remain alert for hours without losing focus, and his talent for blending into the background while maintaining complete situational awareness. When a permanent position opened in the Metropolitan Police Protection Unit in 1978, Michael's name was at the top of the recommendation list. The protection unit was responsible for safeguarding members of the royal family, senior government officials, and visiting dignitaries. It was demanding work that required not just physical courage and quick thinking, but also absolute discretion and the ability to function effectively under intense scrutiny. The training for protection duties was unlike anything Michael had experienced, even during his military service. Physical fitness was important, but mental preparation was crucial. Protection officers had to learn to think like potential threats while maintaining the mindset of guardians. They studied psychology, crowd dynamics, threat assessment, and emergency medical procedures. They trained in everything from defensive driving to diplomatic protocol. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of protection training was learning to balance vigilance with invisibility. A protection officer had to be constantly alert for potential threats while remaining so unobtrusive that their presence didn't interfere with the normal activities of those they were protecting. This required a particular kind of mental discipline, the ability to be simultaneously focused and relaxed, ready to act but not anxious or jumpy. Michael excelled in this training because he understood intuitively that protection work wasn't about being a bodyguard in the Hollywood sense. It wasn't about looking intimidating or being obviously armed. Instead, it was about being a human early warning system, someone whose job was to identify and neutralize potential problems before they became actual threats. By 1979, Michael had been assigned to various protection duties, including several involving junior members of the royal family. He had protected visiting foreign officials, provided security at state functions, and handled the complex logistics of moving high-profile individuals through public spaces safely. Each assignment taught him something new about human behavior, crowd dynamics, or security procedures. His colleagues in the protection unit came to respect Michael's judgment and rely on his instincts. He had a talent for spotting the person in a crowd who didn't quite fit, for sensing when a routine situation was about to become complicated, and for making split-second decisions under pressure. More importantly, he had earned a reputation for being completely trustworthy, someone who would never compromise his duty for personal gain or convenience. As 1980 turned into 1981, Michael found himself increasingly assigned to protection duties involving Prince Charles, who was then a very active and public member of the royal family. The prince's schedule included numerous public appearances, charity events, and official functions, each presenting its own security challenges. Michael learned to adapt to the prince's personality and preferences, understanding when to be more visible for deterrent effect and when to maintain a lower profile. The relationship between a protection officer and their principal is unique in law enforcement. It requires absolute trust on both sides. The principal must trust that their protection officer will keep them safe without interfering unnecessarily in their activities, while the protection officer must be trusted with intimate knowledge of the principal's schedule, habits, and vulnerabilities. Michael approached this responsibility with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized his entire career. He studied not just the security protocols and threat assessments, but also the personalities and preferences of those he was assigned to protect. He understood that effective protection required understanding how his principals thought and behaved, what made them comfortable or uncomfortable, and how they were likely to react in different situations. By the spring of 1981, Detective Sergeant Michael Thompson had become one of the most trusted and experienced protection officers in the Metropolitan Police. His reputation was built not on dramatic incidents or heroic actions, but on thousands of routine assignments completed without incident. He had successfully protected numerous high-profile individuals through countless public appearances, managing to keep them safe while allowing them to carry out their duties normally. What Michael couldn't know was that all of his training, experience, and instincts were about to be tested in a way that would define not just his career, but his entire understanding of what it meant to serve and protect. The skills he had developed over more than a decade in law enforcement, the judgment he had honed through countless situations, and the courage he had demonstrated time and again were all about to converge in a moment that would last only seconds but would resonate for the rest of his life. The morning of March 30th, 1981, began with the kind of crisp spring weather that made London feel full of possibilities. Detective Sergeant Michael Thompson arrived at Scotland Yard at 6:30 in the morning, earlier than required but consistent with his personal routine. He had learned long ago that preparation was the difference between successful protection operations and potentially dangerous situations. The extra 30 minutes allowed him to review the day's schedule thoroughly, check for any overnight intelligence updates, and mentally prepare for the challenges ahead. The briefing room for the protection unit was located in a secure section of Scotland Yard, accessible only to officers with appropriate clearance. As Michael entered, he found Inspector David Harrison already present, reviewing files and making notes. Harrison was a 20-year veteran of protection duties, a man whose calm demeanor and encyclopedic knowledge of security protocols had earned him the respect of everyone in the unit. "Morning, Michael," Harrison said without looking up from his papers. "Today's the charity luncheon at the Guildhall. Prince Charles is the guest of honor. Should be straightforward, but we've had some interesting intelligence overnight." Michael poured himself a cup of tea and settled into his chair. Intelligence updates were a routine part of protection work, but the word interesting in Harrison's vocabulary usually meant something that required careful attention. What kind of intelligence? Harrison spread several photographs and documents across the table. Nothing specific to today's event, but Special Branch has been tracking increased activity among several anti-monarchy groups. Nothing that suggests an organized threat, but enough chatter to keep us alert. Additionally, there's been some unusual activity around several individuals with previous convictions for public order offenses. The photographs showed faces that Michael had seen before, in intelligence briefings. People with histories of disrupting public events, individuals with known extremist views, and a few whose backgrounds suggested they might be capable of more serious actions. None of them represented immediate credible threats, but their collective presence in intelligence reports created what Harrison called an atmosphere of elevated caution. The Guildhall event itself presents standard challenges, Harrison continued. Large crowd, multiple entry points, significant media presence. The venue has been swept twice and will have plainclothes officers positioned throughout the crowd. Your primary assignment is close protection during the prince's arrival and departure, with particular attention to the moments when he'll be most exposed to public interaction. Michael studied the venue layouts and crowd management plans. The Guildhall, with its historic architecture and multiple levels, created several sightlines that required careful monitoring. The event organizers had done their part to create secure areas and controlled access points, but charity events inherently involved less restrictive security than official state functions. The balance between safety and accessibility required constant judgment calls. "What's the prince's schedule looking like?" Michael asked, noting the arrival time and planned route. "He's coming directly from a morning meeting at Clarence House. Arrival at 1:15, brief reception with event organizers and major donors, formal luncheon with speech, some mingling with guests, departure scheduled for 3:30. The challenging moment will be the arrival. He specifically requested to spend a few minutes greeting supporters who have gathered outside." This was typical of Prince Charles, who understood that public appearances required genuine public interaction. Unlike some members of the royal family who preferred more formal, controlled environments, the prince genuinely enjoyed meeting people and seemed to draw energy from crowd interactions. This personality trait made him an effective public figure but created ongoing challenges for his protection officers. As other members of the protection team arrived for the briefing, Michael reviewed the personnel assignments. Detective Constable Sarah Williams would be positioned inside the venue, monitoring the crowd during the luncheon. Detective Constable James Murphy would be responsible for route security and coordination with uniformed officers. Several additional officers would be deployed in plain clothes throughout the area, providing both crowd monitoring and rapid response capabilities. The briefing covered standard protocols for crowd management, communication procedures, emergency response plans, and coordination with other agencies. Every detail had been planned and rehearsed, from the exact route the prince would take to the locations of backup vehicles and medical personnel. Yet Michael knew from experience that no plan, however thorough, could account for every possible variable. The key to successful protection work was maintaining flexibility while adhering to core security principles. After the briefing, Michael spent time studying the most recent photographs of the Guildhall area, familiarizing himself with every entrance, exit, and potential congregation point. He reviewed the profiles of event attendees, paying particular attention to any individuals who had not been pre-screened or whose backgrounds raised any questions. He also studied recent photographs of the various anti-monarchy activists, ensuring he could recognize them quickly if they appeared in the crowd. At 11 o'clock, Michael and Detective Constable Williams conducted a final security sweep of the Guildhall. They walked through every area the prince would access, checking sightlines, exit routes, and communication capabilities. They met with venue security personnel, reviewing procedures for crowd management and emergency response. They tested radio communications with both the command center and other protection officers who would be positioned throughout the area. The Guildhall itself was a magnificent building, its great hall capable of accommodating several hundred guests for the charity luncheon. The historic architecture created both grandeur and security challenges. Multiple levels, numerous alcoves, and decorative elements that could potentially conceal threats or create blind spots. The venue's security team had done excellent work in preparing the space, but Michael noted several areas that would require particular attention during the event. The main challenge will be the arrival, Williams observed as they completed their walkthrough. The supporters gathering outside are enthusiastic but not organized. That kind of spontaneous crowd can be harder to manage than a formal receiving line. Michael agreed. Organized events with predetermined participants and controlled access were relatively straightforward from a security perspective. Spontaneous gatherings, even of well-meaning supporters, created unpredictable dynamics. People might push forward for a better view. Individuals with unknown intentions could blend into the crowd, and the general excitement could mask potential threats until they became immediate dangers. At 12:30, Michael took his position outside the Guildhall. The crowd had been growing throughout the morning, and approximately 200 people were now gathered behind barriers on either side of the entrance route. The atmosphere was festive and positive. People had brought flowers to present to the prince, homemade signs expressing support for his charitable work, and cameras to capture the moment. The Metropolitan Police uniformed officers were managing crowd control professionally, ensuring that barriers remained secure while allowing people to feel included in the event. Michael positioned himself where he could observe both the crowd and the route the prince would take from his vehicle to the building entrance. He maintained radio contact with other protection officers and the command center, receiving regular updates on the prince's progress from Clarence House. Everything appeared normal and well controlled, but Michael's trained instincts kept him alert for anything that seemed out of place. Detective Constable Murphy's voice came through the radio. "Vehicle approaching, ETA 3 minutes." Michael acknowledged and began his final scan of the immediate area. The crowd pressed forward slightly against the barriers, people straining for the best possible view. Camera flashes were already going off as people tested their equipment. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Michael's attention was drawn to a young man near the front of the crowd, who seemed different from the others around him. While most people were smiling, chatting with neighbors, or adjusting their cameras, this individual appeared tense and focused. He was well-dressed and didn't obviously seem threatening, but something about his demeanor triggered Michael's protective instincts. The man kept checking his watch and scanning the area in a way that suggested he was waiting for something specific rather than simply hoping to see the prince. "Command, this is Thompson." Michael spoke quietly into his radio. "I have eyes on a possible person of interest, approximately 20 meters from the entrance, male, early 20s, dark overcoat. Requesting background check if possible." "Copy that, Thompson. Can you get a clearer description?" Michael moved to a better vantage point, careful not to draw attention to himself while keeping the individual under observation. The young man was approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall. Medium build, dark hair. Wearing a well-tailored overcoat that seemed expensive for someone his age. He carried a small bag that could contain flowers or a gift, but his behavior remained inconsistent with the other well-wishers in the crowd. "Command, subject appears well-dressed, carrying small bags, behavior inconsistent with other crowd members. Appears to be waiting for something specific, rather than general crowd enthusiasm." "Understood. Vehicle arriving now." Michael could see the royal car approaching, its route cleared by motorcycle officers and followed by backup vehicles. The crowd's excitement increased noticeably, people pressing forward and raising cameras. In the midst of this general movement, Michael noticed that the young man he had been watching had moved closer to the barrier and appeared to be reaching into his bag. This was the moment when years of training and experience crystallized into instant decision-making. Michael's position allowed him to reach the young man quickly, but doing so would mean leaving his assigned post and potentially creating a disturbance if his suspicions proved unfounded. The royal car was less than 50 meters away. The prince would be stepping out of the vehicle within 30 seconds. The young man's hand was now inside his bag, and his expression had changed from nervous anticipation to focused determination. Michael made his choice. Moving through the crowd as quickly as possible without causing panic, he approached the young man from behind. As the royal car came to a stop and Prince Charles began to emerge, Michael reached the barrier just as the young man withdrew something from his bag. What happened in the next 5 seconds would be debated, analyzed, and remembered for decades to come. The young man's hand emerged from his bag, holding what appeared to be a dark metallic object. Michael's training and instincts told him that hesitation could be fatal. Without knowing exactly what the object was, but recognizing the potential threat it represented, Michael acted on the principle that had guided his entire career. When in doubt, protect the principle at all costs. The crowd around them was cheering and reaching forward as Prince Charles approached the barrier to greet his supporters. The noise level made communication impossible. Camera flashes created a strobing effect that made it difficult to see clearly. In this environment of controlled chaos, Michael had to make a decision based on incomplete information but guided by unwavering duty. The young man raised the object in his hand, pointing it toward the approaching prince. Michael's response was instantaneous, decisive, and would change everything that followed. In one fluid movement, he reached over the barrier, grasped the young man's wrist, and forced his hand downward while simultaneously identifying himself as a police officer. The object fell from the young man's hand and clattered onto the pavement. As it hit the ground, Michael could see what it actually was, and in that instant, he understood the full complexity of the situation he had just intervened in. The split-second decision that had seemed so clear-cut in the moment of action now revealed layers of consequence that would extend far beyond this single afternoon. The crowd around them had noticed the disturbance, but most people were still focused on Prince Charles, who continued his approach toward the barrier, unaware of what had just transpired mere meters from where he was greeting supporters. Michael maintained his grip on the young man while quickly assessing whether additional threats were present and determining the best course of action for the immediate situation. What Michael had discovered would transform a routine protection assignment into a defining moment of his career, a decision that would be scrutinized, analyzed, and ultimately celebrated as an example of the split-second judgment that protection officers must be prepared to make when duty and uncertainty collide. The metallic object that clattered to the pavement was a starting pistol. As Michael maintained his grip on the young man's wrist and quickly scanned the ground, the reality of the situation became clear. The weapon was designed to fire blank cartridges for athletic events, but at close range, even blank rounds could cause serious injury or death. More significantly, the realistic appearance of the weapon would have created immediate chaos if it had been seen by the crowd, or, worse, if it had been fired.
"Don't move," Michael said firmly to the young man, who appeared shocked by the sudden intervention.
The individual was younger than Michael had initially estimated, perhaps 19 or 20, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested either extreme anxiety or dangerous intent. His eyes were wide with what could have been fear, surprise, or anger. Michael couldn't be certain which. Through his radio earpiece, Michael could hear the ongoing coordination of the prince's arrival. Primary is approaching the crowd, everything appears normal. The other protection officers were unaware of the situation developing just meters away from where Prince Charles was beginning to greet supporters. Michael faced a critical decision. He could immediately call for backup and create a situation that would disrupt the entire event, potentially causing panic among the hundreds of people present. Alternatively, he could attempt to handle the situation quietly while maintaining observation of both the individual and the ongoing royal visit. His choice would depend on his assessment of whether this was a confused young person who had made a serious error in judgment or a genuine threat that required immediate dramatic response. "What's your name?" Michael asked the young man, keeping his voice low but authoritative. "Marcus," the young man replied, his voice shaking. "Marcus Webb." "I didn't mean... I wasn't going to. What were you planning to do with the pistol, Marcus?" "It's just blanks," Marcus said quickly. "I wasn't going to hurt anyone. I thought if I fired it into the air when he walked by, people would notice. People would pay attention to what I had to say." Michael's training had included extensive instruction on threat assessment, and this response provided crucial information. Marcus appeared to be someone who had planned a dramatic gesture rather than a genuine attack. However, the distinction between a misguided protest and a deadly threat was often impossible to determine in the moment, and Michael knew that his primary responsibility was ensuring the safety of Prince Charles, regardless of Marcus's actual intentions. "Marcus, I'm Detective Sergeant Thompson with the Metropolitan Police. I need you to stay exactly where you are and keep your hands visible. Do you understand?" Marcus nodded, tears now visible in his eyes. "I wasn't going to hurt anyone. I just My father was killed in Northern Ireland last year. He was a soldier. I wanted the prince to know that people are dying and nobody seems to care. I thought if I made enough noise, maybe someone would listen. This revelation added another layer of complexity to the situation. Marcus wasn't an anti-monarchy extremist or a dangerous individual with a history of violence. He was a grieving young man who had lost his father in military service and had chosen an extremely poor method of trying to draw attention to his cause. His intentions might have been rooted in grief rather than malice, but the potential consequences of his planned actions could have been catastrophic. Michael could see Prince Charles moving along the barrier, shaking hands and accepting flowers from well-wishers. The prince was approximately 10 meters away and approaching the area where Marcus stood. If Marcus had succeeded in firing the starting pistol into the air, the sound would have been interpreted by other protection officers as gunfire. Their training would have required them to immediately cover the prince and evacuate him from the area, likely using physical force to move him to safety. The crowd would have panicked, potentially leading to trampling injuries or worse. Additionally, the sound of what appeared to be gunfire near a member of the royal family would have triggered massive security responses throughout London. Armed response units would have been dispatched, the area would have been sealed off, and the incident would have been treated as a potential assassination attempt until proven otherwise. The consequences would have extended far beyond the immediate event. Marcus, I understand you're grieving for your father, and I'm sorry for your loss, Michael said, maintaining his grip on the young man's wrist while keeping his voice calm and steady. But what you're planning to do would have created a situation where innocent people could have been seriously hurt. Do you understand that? Marcus looked around at the crowd of families, elderly supporters, and children who had come to see the prince. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the full implications of his planned action. I didn't think. I just wanted someone to listen. No one talks about the soldiers who are dying. No one seems to care. I care, Marcus. Many people care. But this isn't the way to honor your father's memory or help other families who are dealing with similar losses. Prince Charles was now only a few meters away. Michael had to make an immediate decision about how to handle the situation. He could quietly escort Marcus away from the barrier, potentially allowing the prince's visit to continue normally. However, Marcus was still a potential threat, and removing him from the immediate area would require explanations that could disrupt the event. Alternatively, Michael could maintain his position and continue managing Marcus while the prince passed by, but this approach carried the risk that Marcus might attempt something unpredictable. Marcus, I'm going to ask Detective Constable Williams to come over here and talk with you. She's going to help us sort this out, but I need you to promise me that you won't do anything sudden or unexpected. Can you give me that promise? Marcus nodded again, wiping tears from his eyes. I promise. I'm sorry. I didn't think it through. I just missed my dad, and I wanted someone important to know that he mattered. Michael activated his radio, speaking in a code that would alert other officers to the situation without creating alarm among the crowd. Control, this is Thompson. I need Williams to move to my position for crowd management assistance. No immediate threat, but require additional personnel. Copy, Thompson. Williams is moving to your location. Prince Charles was now greeting people directly adjacent to where Michael and Marcus stood. The prince appeared relaxed and genuinely pleased to be meeting his supporters. He accepted flowers, shook hands, and chatted briefly with several individuals. His natural warmth and genuine interest in the people he met was evident, making it clear why these public interactions were so important to him despite the security challenges they created. Detective Constable Williams approached Michael's position, immediately recognizing that something unusual was occurring. Michael made eye contact with her and indicated with a subtle gesture that she should take a position where she could assist with crowd management while being ready to respond if the situation escalated. Your Highness, Michael heard Marcus whisper as the prince approached their section of the barrier. Your Highness, my father died serving our country. Prince Charles, who had exceptional hearing and genuine sensitivity to people's emotions, seemed to sense that this was more than a casual greeting. He moved toward Marcus with the kind of attention that suggested he understood he was encountering someone with something important to say. I'm very sorry for your loss, the prince said, making direct eye contact with Marcus. Was your father in military service? Yes, sir. He was killed in Belfast last year. Sergeant David Webb, Royal Ulster Rifles. The prince's expression changed, becoming more serious and focused. Michael realized that this was one of those moments that demonstrated why Prince Charles was so effective in his public role. Despite the hundreds of people present and the demanding schedule, he was able to recognize and respond to genuine human need when he encountered it. Sergeant Webb was your father? the prince asked. I remember hearing about his sacrifice. He died protecting others, didn't he? Marcus nodded, no longer able to speak as emotion overwhelmed him. Michael watched this interaction with fascination and concern. The prince's genuine compassion was diffusing the situation more effectively than any security protocol could have managed, but Michael remained alert for any signs that Marcus might still pose a threat. Your father's service and sacrifice will not be forgotten, the prince continued. I want you to know that personally. Would you be willing to share your contact information with one of my staff? I'd like to ensure that you receive proper recognition for your father's service. This was exactly what Marcus had been desperately seeking. Acknowledgement that his father's death mattered. Recognition that the sacrifice meant something to someone in authority. The elaborate and dangerous plan he had devised became unnecessary in the face of direct, genuine human compassion. Michael realized that he was witnessing something remarkable. The combination of his own intervention to prevent a potentially dangerous situation and the prince's instinctive response to human need had transformed what could have been a disaster into a moment of genuine connection and healing. Marcus received the acknowledgement he had been seeking, but through human compassion rather than dramatic gesture. Detective Constable Williams stepped forward and quietly introduced herself to Marcus, explaining that she would help him provide his contact information to the prince's staff. The transition was smooth and professional, allowing the prince to continue meeting other supporters while ensuring that Marcus's needs were addressed appropriately. As Prince Charles moved on to greet other people in the crowd, Michael maintained his position near Marcus, ensuring that the situation remained stable. The starting pistol remained on the ground where it had fallen, and Michael discreetly retrieved it, placing it in an evidence bag for later processing. The entire incident, from Michael's initial observation of Marcus to the prince's compassionate response, had lasted less than 10 minutes, but its implications would resonate far beyond that brief time frame. Thank you, Marcus said to Michael as Williams completed the process of collecting his information. I know what I was planning was wrong. I just didn't know how else to make anyone listen. I understand, Michael replied. Grief can make us consider actions we would never normally contemplate. The important thing is that no one was hurt, and you found a better way to honor your father's memory. The prince's visit continued normally, with the remaining crowd interactions proceeding smoothly. Michael maintained his protective position, but his attention was now divided between ongoing security concerns and reflection on what had just occurred. The incident had tested every aspect of his training and judgment, requiring him to make split-second decisions based on incomplete information while balancing multiple competing priorities. As the prince prepared to enter the Guildhall for the charity luncheon, Michael realized that the true test of his actions would come in the hours and days that followed. He would need to write detailed reports explaining his decisions and actions. The incident would be reviewed by his superiors, analyzed for lessons learned, and potentially scrutinized by media if details became public. Most importantly, he would need to process his own understanding of what had happened and how it might influence his future approach to protection duties. The charity luncheon proceeded flawlessly, but Michael's mind remained partially focused on processing the implications of the morning's events. As Prince Charles delivered his speech about the importance of supporting veterans and their families, words that would have carried special meaning for Marcus Webb, Michael found himself reflecting on the complex chain of circumstances that had led to his intervention. After the prince's departure from the Guildhall at 3:30, Michael returned to Scotland Yard to begin the extensive documentation process that followed any security incident involving a potential threat to a protected individual. The report would need to detail every aspect of his observations, decisions, and actions, providing a complete record for review by his superiors and, potentially, by intelligence services who tracked threats against the royal family. Inspector Harrison was waiting in the briefing room when Michael arrived, along with Detective Chief Inspector Margaret Foster, who oversaw all investigations involving potential threats to royal family members. The presence of a senior officer indicated that the incident was being taken seriously, but not necessarily that Michael's actions were being questioned. Michael, sit down and walk us through exactly what happened, Harrison said, his tone professional but supportive. Take your time and include every detail you can remember. Michael began with his initial observation of Marcus Webb's behavior that had seemed inconsistent with other members of the crowd. He described the young man's nervous demeanor, his frequent checking of his watch, and the way he had positioned himself near the barrier. He explained his decision to radio for a background check and his growing concern as the royal vehicle approached. When I saw him reaching into his bag, I had to make a judgment call, Michael continued. His body language and behavior suggested he was preparing to do something, and given the proximity to the prince, I couldn't afford to wait and see what it was. Tell us about the moment you decided to intervene, DCI Foster said. What specifically convinced you that immediate action was necessary? When he withdrew what appeared to be a metallic object from his bag and began to raise it toward the prince, I acted on the assumption that any unknown object in that situation represented a potential threat. I understand that, in retrospect, knowing it was a starting pistol loaded with blanks, the threat level was different than if it had been a conventional firearm. But in the moment, I had to base my decision on what I could observe and the potential consequences of inaction. Harrison nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right approach. You can't protect someone effectively if you wait until you have complete information about potential threats. By the time you know for certain whether something is dangerous, it's often too late to prevent harm. DCI Foster asked about the conversation with Marcus, particularly his explanation of his motivations and his apparent lack of intent to harm anyone. This line of questioning explored the distinction between someone who posed a genuine threat and someone who was simply making extremely poor decisions while dealing with grief and frustration. His stated intention was to fire the starting pistol into the air to draw attention to his cause, Michael explained. He believed that creating a dramatic moment would force people to listen to his concerns about military casualties. He seemed genuinely shocked when I explained the potential consequences of his plan. Did you believe his explanation? Foster asked. Yes, I did. His emotional response seemed genuine, and his surprise at the implications of his actions suggested that he hadn't thought through the full consequences. However, I also recognized that regardless of his intentions, the results could have been catastrophic. The questioning continued for nearly 2 hours, covering every aspect of the incident and Michael's response. The senior officers were particularly interested in his decision-making process, the information available to him at each moment, and his assessment of Marcus's threat level both before and after the intervention. What's particularly impressive, Harrison observed, is how you managed the situation after the initial intervention. You could have immediately called for backup and treated this as a major incident, but your assessment allowed you to handle it more discreetly while maintaining security. DCI Foster agreed. The combination of your threat assessment skills and your ability to read the situation prevented what could have been a very public and disruptive incident. More importantly, your actions may have prevented Marcus from making a decision that would have destroyed his own life, as well as potentially causing harm to others. The formal interview concluded with Foster explaining the next steps in the process. Marcus Webb would be formally questioned about his actions and intentions, but given his age, his grief over his father's death, and the fact that no actual harm had been intended or caused, the focus would be on getting him appropriate support rather than pursuing serious criminal charges. The prince has already asked his staff to follow up on the promise he made to Marcus, Foster added. Apparently, he was genuinely moved by the young man's grief and wants to ensure that military families receive better support and recognition. 3 days later, Michael was summoned to a meeting that he hadn't expected. The location was Clarence House, and he was informed that Prince Charles had requested to speak with him personally about the incident at the Guildhall. This was unusual. Protection officers typically operated in the background, and their successes were measured by the absence of incidents rather than by recognition or acknowledgement. Michael arrived at Clarence House wearing his best suit, uncertain of what to expect from the meeting. He was escorted to a comfortable sitting room where Prince Charles was waiting, dressed casually and appearing more relaxed than Michael had ever seen him during official engagements. Detective Sergeant Thompson, thank you for coming, the prince said, rising to shake hands. Please, sit down. I wanted to speak with you personally about what happened at the Guildhall. Your Royal Highness, Michael replied, uncertain of the appropriate protocol for this type of conversation. I've read the reports about your actions that day, the prince continued, and I wanted you to know how grateful I am for your judgment and professionalism. But I also wanted to discuss something that I think you'll find interesting about young Marcus Webb. The prince explained that his staff had followed up on the promise he had made to Marcus, arranging for him to receive counseling support and connecting him with organizations that assist military families dealing with loss. More significantly, Marcus had become involved in charity work supporting veterans, channeling his grief and passion into positive action rather than disruptive gestures. What strikes me most about the entire situation, the prince said, is how your intervention created the opportunity for a better outcome than anyone could have anticipated. If Marcus had succeeded in his original plan, he would have been arrested, possibly imprisoned, and certainly would have been unable to contribute to the causes he cares about. Instead, he's found a constructive way to honor his father's memory. This perspective hadn't occurred to Michael. He had focused on preventing immediate harm to the prince and managing the security implications of the incident. The longer-term positive consequences for Marcus himself were an unexpected benefit of the intervention. I've also been thinking about the security implications, the prince continued. Your report mentioned that Marcus seemed surprised by the potential consequences of his plan. That suggests to me that there may be other people dealing with similar grief and frustration who might not fully understand the implications of dramatic gestures. I'm wondering if there's more we could do to reach people before they make destructive choices. This conversation revealed an aspect of the prince's character that Michael had only glimpsed during public appearances. Behind the formal protocols and official duties was someone who genuinely cared about individual human welfare and who thought deeply about the broader implications of every situation he encountered. Your Royal Highness, if I may ask, how do you think about the balance between security and accessibility? Michael asked. Your willingness to interact directly with the public creates security challenges, but clearly it also creates opportunities for the kind of positive outcome we saw with Marcus. That's the fundamental question, isn't it? The prince replied. If I'm so protected that I never encounter genuine human need, then I can't fulfill the most important aspects of my role. But if security is inadequate, then I can't fulfill any aspects of my role. The answer seems to be having protection officers like you, who can distinguish between genuine threats and people who simply need compassion and understanding. Michael left Clarence House with a fundamentally changed understanding of his role as a protection officer. The conversation had revealed that effective security wasn't just about preventing harm, it was about creating an environment where positive human interaction could occur safely. The prince's gratitude was meaningful, but more importantly, the discussion had highlighted the complexity and importance of the work he was doing. 2 weeks after the incident, Michael received a formal commendation from the Metropolitan Police for his actions at the Guildhall. The citation praised his exceptional judgment under pressure, professional discretion, and successful prevention of a potentially serious security incident. The commendation would become part of his permanent record and would influence future assignment opportunities within the protection unit. However, the most meaningful recognition came in a handwritten note from Marcus Webb, delivered through official channels to ensure security protocols were maintained. In the note, Marcus thanked Michael for saving me from making the biggest mistake of my life, and described how the counseling and charity work had helped him process his grief constructively. I understand now that what I was planning wouldn't have honored my father's memory, Marcus wrote. It would have dishonored it. Thank you for giving me the chance to find a better way to make a difference. Michael kept the note in his desk drawer, rereading it occasionally when the demands of protection work became particularly challenging. It served as a reminder that the decisions he made in moments of uncertainty could have consequences far beyond immediate security concerns. The incident also influenced Michael's approach to threat assessment in subsequent assignments. He became even more skilled at reading crowd dynamics and individual behavior, but he also developed a deeper understanding of the motivations that might drive people to make poor decisions. This psychological insight enhanced his ability to distinguish between genuine threats and people who were struggling with personal crises. 6 months later, Michael was promoted to detective inspector and given increased responsibilities within the protection unit. His superiors noted that his handling of the Guildhall incident demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and discretion required for senior protection roles. His ability to balance security concerns with human compassion had proven invaluable in a role that required both tactical skills and emotional intelligence. The lessons learned from the Marcus Webb incident would influence Michael's approach to protection work for the remainder of his career. He understood that the most dangerous situations weren't always the most obvious ones, and that the most effective responses weren't always the most dramatic ones. Sometimes, preventing disaster required nothing more than careful observation, sound judgment, and the courage to act decisively when action was needed. 5 years after the incident at the Guildhall, Detective Inspector Michael Thompson found himself training the next generation of protection officers at the Metropolitan Police Academy. The case study he used most frequently in his lectures was drawn from his own experience with Marcus Webb, though he never identified himself as the officer involved. The incident had become part of the official curriculum for protection training, illustrating the complex judgment calls that officers must be prepared to make when incomplete information and time pressure collide. The key principle, Michael would tell his trainees, is that protection work requires you to think several steps ahead while being prepared to act on incomplete information. You can't wait for certainty because certainty often comes too late to prevent harm, but you also can't react to every anomaly as if it represents an immediate threat, because that would make normal public interaction impossible. The classroom where Michael conducted these training sessions was filled with young officers who reminded him of his own early years in law enforcement. They were eager, dedicated, and convinced that protection work was primarily about physical courage and quick reflexes. Michael's job was to help them understand that the most important skills were psychological insight, situational awareness, and the ability to make complex ethical judgments under pressure. Consider this scenario, Michael would say, describing the Guildhall incident without revealing his personal involvement. You observe someone in a crowd whose behavior seems inconsistent with other members of the public. You have seconds to decide whether to intervene. What factors do you consider? The trainees would offer various answers. The person's proximity to the principal, their physical appearance, whether they were carrying anything suspicious, their general demeanor. All of these factors were important, but Michael pushed them to think more deeply about the human psychology involved. What if the person you're observing isn't a threat in the conventional sense, but rather someone who's dealing with grief, frustration, or mental health issues? How do you balance the need to protect your principal with the responsibility not to unnecessarily traumatize someone who may simply be struggling with personal problems? This question usually generated significant discussion among the trainees. Some argued that protection officers couldn't afford to consider the psychological state of potential threats, that their primary duty was prevention of harm to the principal regardless of other considerations. Others suggested that unnecessary intervention could create its own problems, both for the individuals involved and for public trust in security procedures. The answer, Michael would explain, is that effective protection requires both decisive action and human judgment. You must be prepared to act immediately when necessary, but you also must be skilled enough to assess situations accurately and respond proportionally. The training program that Michael developed based on his experiences included extensive instruction in psychology, crisis intervention, and de-escalation techniques. Protection officers learned not just how to physically restrain potential threats, but how to recognize and respond appropriately to people experiencing various forms of psychological distress. One of Michael's most promising trainees was Detective Constable Emma Richardson, a former military police officer who had joined the Metropolitan Police after completing her service in the Army. Richardson possessed the physical skills and tactical awareness that were essential for protection work, but she also demonstrated the kind of intuitive understanding of human behavior that couldn't be taught through conventional training. "Inspector, I've been thinking about the case study you presented last week," Richardson said after one training session. The officer who intervened with the young man carrying the starting pistol, how did he know that the person wasn't a genuine threat after he had made the initial intervention? This was exactly the kind of question that demonstrated Richardson's potential for advanced protection work. "What do you think?" Michael asked, using the Socratic method he had adopted for developing critical thinking skills in his trainees. "I think it came down to listening," Richardson replied, "not just hearing what the person said, but understanding the emotions behind the words. Someone who's genuinely dangerous would have responded differently to being confronted than someone who's grieving and confused." Michael nodded approvingly.
That's exactly right.
The ability to read people accurately is often more important than physical intervention skills. Most people who pose threats to protected individuals aren't professional assassins or trained operatives. They're individuals dealing with personal crises who have made poor decisions about how to address their problems. As the training program evolved, Michael incorporated regular contact with mental health professionals, social workers, and crisis intervention specialists. Protection officers needed to understand not just security protocols, but also human psychology and social dynamics. The goal was to create security professionals who could distinguish between genuine threats and people who needed help, and who could respond appropriately to both categories. The impact of Michael's training approach became evident during a visit by the Prime Minister to a university campus several months later. Detective Constable Richardson, now assigned to protection duties, noticed a student whose behavior seemed agitated and potentially threatening. Rather than immediately calling for backup, Richardson approached the student and discovered that he was upset about university policies affecting military veterans' educational benefits. Richardson's response demonstrated the effectiveness of Michael's training methods. She acknowledged the student's concerns, connected him with appropriate university resources, and managed the situation without creating a security incident. The student's grievances were addressed through proper channels, and the Prime Minister's visit continued without disruption. "That's exactly the kind of outcome we're trying to achieve," Michael told Richardson during their debriefing session. "You prevented a potential problem while treating the individual involved with dignity and respect. That's what professional protection work looks like." Meanwhile, Marcus Webb had become a successful advocate for military families and veterans' rights. His charity work had evolved into a full-time career with a national veterans organization where he developed programs to support families dealing with combat-related losses. He had never forgotten the intervention at the Guildhall or the compassionate response from Prince Charles, and he often spoke about how that experience had changed the direction of his life. In 1987, Marcus was invited to speak at a conference on security and public safety, where he shared his perspective on the incident from the standpoint of someone who had been prevented from making a catastrophic mistake. His presentation was powerful and moving, describing how grief and frustration had led him to plan an action that would have accomplished nothing positive while destroying his own future. "The protection officer who intervened that day saved my life in more ways than one," Marcus told the conference audience. "He prevented me from taking an action that would have been interpreted as an attack on someone I actually respected and admired. More importantly, he created an opportunity for me to find constructive ways to honor my father's memory and help other families dealing with similar losses." Michael attended that conference, sitting anonymously in the audience as Marcus described the incident. Hearing Marcus's perspective 6 years later reinforced Michael's understanding of how protective actions could have consequences far beyond immediate security concerns. The intervention had prevented not just potential harm to Prince Charles, but also the destruction of a young man's life and the loss of his subsequent positive contributions to society. The conference also featured presentations from other security professionals who had dealt with similar situations. Michael realized that the challenges he had faced at the Guildhall were not unique. Protection officers regularly encountered individuals whose threatening behavior was motivated by personal crisis rather than genuine malicious intent. The security community was beginning to recognize the need for more sophisticated approaches to threat assessment and response. This recognition led to Michael being invited to participate in a working group that developed new national guidelines for protection operations. The guidelines emphasized the importance of psychological training for security personnel and established protocols for managing situations involving individuals who might pose threats due to mental health issues or personal crises. "Protection work has evolved significantly over the past decade," Michael wrote in a report for the working group. "We've moved beyond a purely tactical approach to security and begun incorporating psychological and social understanding into our threat assessment and response procedures. This evolution makes our principles safer while also ensuring that security operations don't unnecessarily harm individuals who may be struggling with personal problems." The guidelines that emerged from this working group were adopted by police forces throughout the United Kingdom and eventually influenced international standards for close protection operations. Michael's experience at the Guildhall had contributed to a fundamental shift in how security professionals understood and performed their duties. In 1988, 8 years after the Guildhall incident, Michael was promoted to Detective Chief Inspector and given responsibility for overseeing all protection operations involving the royal family. This position represented the pinnacle of achievement in his chosen field. Recognition of his expertise and judgment developed over more than 2 decades of law enforcement service. The role brought new challenges and responsibilities, including coordination with intelligence services, oversight of protection operations across multiple venues and events, and management of an expanding team of protection officers. However, the core principles that had guided Michael's approach since the beginning of his career remained unchanged. Careful observation, sound judgment, decisive action when necessary, and always keeping the human element at the center of every decision. Prince Charles, who had continued to follow Michael's career with interest, made a point of congratulating him on the promotion during a routine security briefing. "I remember our conversation after the Guildhall incident," the prince said. "You've built an entire career on the principles we discussed that day, balancing security with humanity, protection with accessibility. It's made an enormous difference in how protection operations are conducted." As Michael looked back on his career from this new position of responsibility, he realized that the incident at the Guildhall had been a defining moment not just for him personally, but for the evolution of protection work generally. The split-second decisions he had made that day had influenced training programs, policy development, and the careers of dozens of other protection officers. More importantly, the intervention had changed the trajectory of Marcus Webb's life, leading to positive contributions that had benefited thousands of military families over the subsequent years. This outcome demonstrated that protection work wasn't just about preventing harm. It was about creating opportunities for positive human interaction and constructive problem-solving. The legacy of that March afternoon in 1981 would continue to influence Michael's approach to security challenges for the remainder of his career. Every time he faced a situation requiring split-second judgment, he remembered the lesson learned at the Guildhall. Sometimes the greatest courage is demonstrated not through dramatic action, but through careful thought, sound judgment, and the willingness to see the humanity in every individual encountered during the course of duty. 20 years later, as Michael prepared to retire from the Metropolitan Police, he reflected on how a single moment of decision had shaped not only his own career, but also the lives of many others. The courage required for effective protection work wasn't just physical bravery, It was the moral courage to make difficult decisions under pressure while never losing sight of the human consequences of those decisions.